really excited to get to talk to you tonight. I wanted to start by talking about stories. So I was an English major, and I feel like I've been an English major like since long before I was ever an undergrad. Like my whole life I sort of like was a closet English major. I never even knew that I was one. But I've always loved literature and reading, grammar. One of my apparently not so secret hobbies is I like to take a book like maybe Charles Dickens or Shakespeare, just something that's written in a little bit of an older style of English, and draw back. I like to take baths. And then take the book and I go in the bathtub and I read it out loud to myself in like a British accent, which I'm really bad at. As I'm reading, sometimes it devolves into like an Australian accent or like some other variation of that. But anyways, the point of this is I like stories, and I'm not alone. Stories have been a part of every culture for as long as there have been cultures. Before we had language, stories were a way of history telling, communicating the past. Stories are a way of teaching moral lessons. Stories are a way of remembering where we come from, about teaching us where we're headed, and on and on and on it goes, right? If you can think of a group of people, there are probably stories associated with what it means to be a part of that group of people. So like we are Americans. Oh, well, that's probably not a good one. Some of us are Americans. All of us are living in America at the moment. So we have stories about what it means to be an American. We talk about the Boston Tea Party and sticking it to the Brits and throwing it in the harbor. And we talk about, you know, different aspects of our independence. We talk about Rosa Parks and when she sat down for her rights, and what does it mean to have equal opportunities for different kinds of people. And so we have these stories that sort of define us as who we are as a nation. And then we have stories that define us at Stanford, right? Or maybe a better example here would be sort of people we hold out as our champions, like Mr. Hewlett and Packard and those guys from Google and Tiger Woods and all the people that have come before us, and we sort of talk about them like legends, right? That this is a part of who we are. We look at them and we think this is a part of our culture. When my family was big in telling stories when I was growing up. Every night before we went to bed, we got to read a book, but then we also like got mom or dad to tell us a story. And sometimes they were made up about like princesses and stuff. But I was much more interested in stories about things that had actually happened or people that I knew, particularly stories about me. Those were my favorite kind. And there was one story that I would always beg my dad to tell. It was the story of the 3 butterfly bandages. So I'm going to tell it to you. So you're privileged, right? When I was little, I grew up in Alaska, and we used to travel a lot in the summers. One summer, my grandparents came to visit, and so we rented a motorhome, which is awesome if you've never been in one. It's like a giant, well, it's House on Wheels. And there's like a kitchen and beds and bathroom and everything. And so we took it up to the national park. It's about 7 hours from our house. And we were going to go camping, go fishing, do that kind of thing. And so after we had arrived, everybody was settling in, and I was playing up in the front. And I fell from my seat onto the dashboard and cut my head open. There's like this big bleeding gash on my forehead. And I was panicking, because when you're little and you get a head injury, it's a lot of blood, and it's like dripping into my eye, and so I'm like freaked out. And so I start screaming, so Dad comes, scoops me up, he takes me over to the National Park Hotel, where they employ a full-time nurse on staff. And so he takes me in to see her, and she's like really calm and patient, and she gets out butterfly bandages, which is all that means is a band-aid with a butterfly on it. And she puts 3 butterfly bandages on my head, so I didn't have to have stitches, and everything ended up being okay. Okay, so that's the story of the 3 butterfly bandages. It's not a very interesting story. Like, not very much happens. In fact, like, most preschoolers have an injury like this maybe once a week. But, like, the way that my dad would tell this story had, like, all the drama of a Hollywood movie, you know, and then he would really get into the details about what people were feeling and what we were wearing and how bad it was when he found me, but how brave that I was. And when we got there, it was not 1, not 2, but 3 butterfly bandages on my forehead. And it was just like this really legend in our family. In fact, I called him today to just make sure I had my details right. And so he told me the story. He goes, I don't know why we told you that story so much. But the story was important. The story reminded me that I came from a family that cared about me. that I was a part of something that was bigger than I was, that we would go on vacations together, and that I was a part of those memories. And it told me that when bad things happened to me, I had people who were going to look out for me and take care of me. And that story reminded me that I had the capacity to be brave when things were hard, because that's about the worst thing that can happen to a 3-year-old. Well, at least to this 3-year-old, right? And so I liked that story. I liked hearing it. When I got a little older, my tastes in stories changed in my family. I wanted to know about the stories that had happened before I was born. I wanted to know about my parents and when they were kids and when they were dating, and my grandparents, and what life had been like before I existed. And so every time we all got together, I would ask people to tell me their story because I wanted to hear. And my grandmother, she tells a great story. She loved to tell me about when she and my granddad were dating. So Granddad was a Navy man. He was in World War II. And I'm just taking my liberty to tell you guys some stories. I didn't know that we were going to tell this many. But so he was in World War II, and he came home on the GI Bill and went to engineering school at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And Graham was a farm gal from the country in Colorado who got accepted to nurses college in Denver to be a military nurse. But the war ended before she ever finished her classes. So she met Granddad when one of his buddies started dating a gal that lived in the boarding house where she lived. And the boarding house was really strict about men coming to visit and curfew. And so when he would come and pick her up for a date, he'd have to wait on the porch. And then he'd have to have her back at a certain time. And they did this whole thing. And she talked about how he was such a gentleman and he always followed all the rules. And how the different dates that they would go on. One of her favorites, he took her to Red Rock Amphitheater for Easter morning sunrise service one time when they were dating, and he picked her up at 3:30 in the morning to get there on time, which was just scandalous of an hour of day to be seen with a man, and how she had planned her outfit to have this skirt and this dress, and that she hadn't taken into account that the sun wouldn't even have come up yet, and that it would be very cold outside, and that they were going up into the mountains. And so by the time that she got there, she was freezing. But of course, he gave her his coat because he was just that kind of guy, and wink at me, you know. And so she would just tell you these stories, and she loved to talk about his car. Not all the men in those days had a car, but he had a car, and he could take her places. And you should always go with a guy that can take her places. She would tell me about, you know, that they would go on dates, and that because he lived in Boulder and she lived in Denver, having a car meant that they could see each other often. And so she told me a story one time about how he came to pick her up, and she got her coat on the porch, and she came out and the car wasn't there. And she said, well, where's the car? He said, oh, we're taking the bus today. And she said, well, what are we doing? And he said, it's a surprise. And it's going to be a surprise for you, because I'm going to finish that story in a little bit, because I have another story that I want to tell, and it's even better than this story. I want to talk to you guys tonight about Jesus' story. And in order to do that, we're going to start with talking about Passover. Passover, most of you probably know, but we're celebrating it right now if you're Jewish. We're in the middle of the week of the Feast of Passover. It's a remembrance of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, when God intervened on his people's behalf, and in front of the mightiest nation on earth, a nation of servants was set free. And celebrating Passover is a big part about what it means to be Jewish. It's a time where they remember what God did for them. And it's a time where they look forward to a promise. Because God didn't just set them free to wander in the wilderness. He set them free to give them a promised land. And in some ways, they're still holding on to a promise of a promised land, that God's kingdom will come in full and that they'll get to live with him there. And so when they celebrate Passover, it's about past and future, and it's the best kind of story, right? And Passover is about telling that story to each other. And Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples was a Passover feast, and that is not an accident. I wanted to read a little bit about what he said at that feast. But basically, at a Passover feast, there's a lot of tradition. You say the same things as you say year after year, because you're remembering and talking about what has already been. But at this Passover feast, Jesus has something new to say. And we read about that in 1 Corinthians. This is Paul talking. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." And then also in Luke 22, in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." So no longer, Jesus is saying, is the wine that we're drinking about remembering a lamb, right, that died and whose blood was shed on the door frame so that the firstborn child of every family would be passed over by the angel of death. But instead, this is a new cup, because I'm making a new covenant, and I'm a new lamb. And this would be shocking, right? And I don't think the disciples get it. I mean, obviously, we see later on that they don't. But Jesus is inserting himself into this story and saying that I have come to make a new covenant with you, and it's going to be a covenant in my blood. The other thing that's really fascinating about the way that we read these two things is that Jesus says, whenever you do this again, I want you to remember me, remember my blood, and remember my body. He's asking us to remember him in his death, which is really interesting, that he doesn't ask us to remember his birth, or his miracles, or his teachings, or his family, or his disciples, but he's saying, I want you to remember me in my death. I want you to remember this story of what's going to happen. And the disciples don't even know what that is yet. But tonight, that's what we're going to do. This is like family time, right? We're coming together to remember the story. And it's a timely story because as a church, Big C, like we're celebrating it this week, right? Good Friday is this Friday and Easter is this Sunday. And so it's time. It's time to remember the story about what Jesus did for us. And as we do that tonight, we're going to look at it through the eyes of some of the people who were a part of that story. And I want you to think with me about the way that they thought about things and the way that we find ourselves still involved in this story. So we'll start with Peter. Okay, now Peter is one of my favorite disciples. Peter is Mr. Hot and Cold. Peter's the guy who is fighting with Jesus over which side he's going to get to sit on when he gets to heaven. And Peter just like wants to know the end right now. Peter's the guy who, when Jesus is approaching the disciples on the water from the boat, and all of them are scared, Peter hops out of the boat and walks on water because he's just going to walk right over to Jesus. And then he freaks out and starts drowning because that's what Peter is. Right? He's hot and he's cold. And in this story, before Jesus even gives this speech about his body and his blood, he tried to wash the disciples' feet. And when it came to Peter, he was like, "No, I'm not going to let you wash my feet." And Jesus is like, "Peter, if I don't wash you, you're not going to be clean." And he kind of explains what he's trying to do. And Peter's like, "Okay, wash my whole body. My hands, my feet, everything." Like, he's just like, you know, in and out. And this is Peter, as we see him, like, throughout Scripture. And this night is no different. After Jesus has broke bread with his disciples, he says that one of them is going to betray them, and that betrayer is revealed to be Judas. And after Judas is kind of called out in front of everybody at this Last Supper table, Peter says, let's actually look at what Peter says, Mark 14. Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." But Jesus says, you can imagine it like really slowly and patiently, "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. So Peter is sure, right? He's sure of his commitment to Jesus. So let's move to the next frame in the story. The next part that we see of this story is that Jesus has moved from the Last Supper to the Garden of Gethsemane. And it is here where Jesus has come to pray. He knows what comes next. We're moving really quickly into the story about Jesus giving up his life for the people that he loves. And so this trip to the garden is about getting his heart ready before God. It's the place where he prays, "Lord, I know that this is the cup that I have, but if it could be, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done." It's the place where he prays really hard prayers. We see that this is the place where he sweats blood. And so he wants to take his friends with him to back him up because he knows that a hard night is in store, and he's been trying to tell them that. And Peter's one of these guys, right? And so what does Peter do? Peter falls asleep. The guy who was like, "I'll never disown you. Like, I'm in. You can count on me," right? What does Peter do? Well, he falls asleep. Not once. Not twice. But 3 times. 3 times Jesus comes and wakes him up. And Peter just won't wake up until John 18. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "What is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "Well, I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "What is it that you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, our Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" So Peter, though unable to pray, jumps out of his sleep, grabs his sword, and cuts the first guy's ear off that he can get to. So here we have him again, right? He's hot and he's cold. He's insistent on being the one that Jesus can count on, and then he falls asleep when Jesus tells him what to do, and now he's back with his sword. And the night's not even over yet. And so we see that the story moves along, and Jesus heads down to his trial, and we see Peter one last time in this story. Luke 22:56. A servant girl saw him, Peter, seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him," talking about Jesus. But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I do not know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. And so, as we think about Peter weeping, I think that we can maybe see a little bit of ourselves in here. Peter wants to do what Jesus wants him to do. He wants to be the guy who's in the thick of the fray. But when Jesus asks him to do a simple thing, like pray, I don't know, for an hour, Peter falls asleep at the time that Jesus needs him the most. And then when it comes time to be the man standing behind Jesus, taking it confidently, he reaches out for his sword in fear. He just never seems to do the right thing. And sometimes I feel like that. Sometimes I feel like I'm overcommitted. I stand in here and I sing these worship songs. "Lord, you're enough for me. You're everything I've ever wanted. And I give my all to you, my whole heart." And you make all these promises that are totally impossible for a human to keep. And then you go out and you have all these dreams about what you're going to do for God, that you're going to be a missionary and conquer the world. And then you realize, like, when it comes time to quiet time, you're so tired that you just fall asleep with your Bible in your lap. And you realize that you've overcommitted yourself and then you've accomplished nothing at all. And when I read Peter's story, I understand what it would be like to have such a deep desire to do something and yet to be such an utter and total failure at it. And yet this was the disciple that Jesus loved. Later on, we read in Scripture that Jesus tells us that Peter is the rock on which he builds his church, that Peter is the one he chooses to become the foundation for what we are today. Peter, this failed, flawed experiment of a guy, is the guy who becomes the father for who we are when we come together. And so there's hope, right, for us in the story of Peter. But there's also a good dose of reality that we shouldn't do what we're not willing to say. I'm sorry, I said that backward. We shouldn't say what we're not willing to do. And we should listen to our Lord when he asks us to do something. After Peter's denial, Jesus is taken from his trial in front of the Jews, right? They were the ones who had him arrested in the garden. And the Jews take him to a trial in front of the Romans. They do this because the Jews don't have the authority to put someone to death. And so since they are hoping for a death sentence, they take him to someone who they know can deliver on that. And we're going to read about that in John 18. The Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others tell you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priest who handed you over to me. What is it that you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. And with this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." It's a really interesting interplay. We could probably just spend a couple of weeks talking about this little sermon, or this little interchange. But what we see following this is that Pilate, knowing that there is no charge that will hold up in a court of law against Jesus, tries to abdicate his responsibility in this matter to somebody else. First, he sends him to Herod to stand trial somewhere else. And then when that doesn't work, he comes back. He tries to play this game of offering him to go free, but they ask for a murderer instead. And ultimately, we see Pilate washing his hands of the matter, which is sort of a ceremonial way of saying, "I just don't want any part of this." Pilate encounters the truth in Jesus, and he realized that there is no cause against him. And yet, he doesn't stand up for this man that he knows to be innocent. He looks at the problem, and he does nothing about it. Pilate is passive. And I think we can see ourselves here too. I see myself as Pilate when you hear about war and poverty and disease and famine, and you're bombarded by the truth of the reality of the situation. And you know that in Scripture Jesus says, "What you do unto the least of these, you do unto me." And yet you choose to turn your head. You choose to wash your hands, or turn it off, or close the news, because you just don't want to know. And if you know, it's too hard. But truth can't be avoided, right? This is what we see in Pilate's story, that when he encounters truth, there's nothing you can do. And he had to look Jesus in the face and say that I have no cause against this man. And yet he does nothing to defend him. He does nothing to take up his cause. He does nothing to promote what is good and right and true. Instead, he just surrenders him over, knowing what the inevitable consequence of giving him to the guards is going to be. And how often do we do that? Because it's easier. How often do we look at truth and say, I just don't want to handle that right now? But a call to Christ, to be a Christ follower, is to be a person who's deeply committed to pursuing truth, to promoting it, and to doing something about it when you find out what's going wrong. I don't like that I see myself in Pilate, but I think that the fact that I do means at least that there's still a soft place in my heart for the Lord to work with. After the soldiers take Jesus from Pilate's court, he begins to carry his cross up the Via Dolorosa. This is the road of the skull to Golgotha Hill, where eventually they're going to hang him on a tree. And as he's walking, he's carrying his own cross, but it becomes too heavy for him. His body is wounded from lots of abuse that he's already taken that day at the hands of the soldiers. And so the guards recruit a man named Simon to help him. We're in Mark 15. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. In each gospel, it says was forced to. This isn't like an accident. There is no indication that this guy sort of jumped up or volunteered, right, for this job. This is something that he was grafted into outside of his will. They said, Simon, this is what you have to do today. And it obviously wasn't in his plans. When we read about Simon, we see that he's from Cyrene. So this is a northern port city in Africa, and that he is traveling on his way in. So what is likely happening is that he's on his way to a Passover celebration. He's a pilgrim headed in for a religious event. And instead of the plans that he had that day to celebrate a meal with his family, his 2 boys that are traveling with him, he's got a whole nother agenda. He has a cross to carry. And I think what we can learn from the story of Simon is that sometimes we don't choose to carry the cross. Maybe that's true of some of you. Maybe you grew up in a family where being a Christian was your birthright. Your parents went to church, right? And you got to college and you joined a Christian group because that was the thing to do, and you'd always been a part of it before. But you don't take any effort to exert or go beyond what's required, because this isn't a cross that you chose. It's just something you've kind of been forced to carry. But unlike Simon, right, we have a choice. We have a choice whether or not we're going to carry the cross. And carrying the cross is hard. It interrupts our plans. Simon had other dreams for that day, other things to do, but carrying the cross of Jesus interrupted those dreams. And it'll do that for us too. When we choose to carry Jesus' cross in the metaphorical sense, as Paul talks about, when we take it upon ourselves to become a part of Christ's family, we're saying that he has license to interrupt our plans. Maybe you came to Stanford as a freshman with this 5-year plan about where you would be when you graduated, that you would do this certain internship, and that you would work this certain place in the summer, and that you would meet the person that you were going to fall in love with by the time that you were a senior, and you're going to get married, and it was all going to be done, and this was what it was going to be, and this is how your life was. And maybe, as you've been here, you've realized that God's calling you to give a year of your life to missions when you graduate. And that doesn't fit into your plan, and it certainly doesn't fit into your parents' plan, and you don't know how that's going to work out with everything that you have dreamed about for the rest of your life. But if we're going to be people who carry the cross, if we're going to be people who choose, right, to share Jesus' burden, it means that we're people who are willing to have our plans interrupted. And that's what we see in Simon. He didn't choose, but his plans were interrupted. The beauty is we get to choose. For us, it's an honor, right, to partner with Jesus and to become part of what he's asking us to do. But are we willing? Are we willing to allow Jesus to interrupt our plans? Our story's coming to an end. All that's left, right, is for the hero to die. When he reaches the end of this road, they lay the cross on the ground, and they put Jesus on top. And they nail first his hands and then his feet into the wood. They strip him of all of his clothes and every shred of dignity that he has left. And they lift the cross up so that it's hanging on a hillside. There's a sign above him that says, "Here is Jesus, King of the Jews." And as he's standing there naked and bleeding and humiliated, there are 2 groups of people that are watching. The first group are his disciples, his followers, those that had been with him. We know about Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene. We know about some of the men, even Nicodemus, who we read about earlier in Scripture, who stand and watch, who are there for the end. And when we first read about them being there, it's easy to think, wow, they were really faithful. You know, they stuck it out. They kind of hung in there till the end. But when we do a fast forward to Easter, we know that maybe that's not exactly the case. Because you see, on Easter morning, we see some of these disciples, these followers of Jesus, showing up at the tomb where Jesus is, the tomb that he talked about before he died, when he said that he was going to die and then rise again in 3 days. But they don't show up at the tomb 3 days later to see if Jesus is going to be there. They show up with burial clothes and spices in hands, preparing to get his body ready for his final rest. They're not expecting an empty tomb. And so from reading that, we can assume that either they forgot his promise, they didn't understand it, or that they lost hope. These were the people that knew him the best, and yet even they didn't get it. They watched him die there, and they thought that that was the end. And in the moment of his greatest weakness became the moment of their greatest despair. There are another group of people that are watching at the end, and those are a much smaller group, the 2 thieves, once on either side of him, hanging on crosses a lot like his. We look at those 2 thieves in Luke 23. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise." The same circumstances that drove his disciples to doubt and despair led this man to believe that Jesus really was who he said he was. Led him to believe that the kingdom that he was talking about was actually going to come to pass. Led him to ask, could I be a part of this thing, this kingdom that you represent? The same event, the same situation, the same circumstances, but the way that they viewed it was radically different. And that's true for us too. Sometimes life doesn't give you lemons. So sometimes it gives you what's worse than lemons. Sometimes your situation doesn't turn out the way that you wanted to, and the plans that you had and the dreams that you had and everything that the way that you thought it was going to be doesn't work out, and you see it falling apart around you. In this case, they were watching their hope for the future die in front of them. Has that ever happened to you? To watch your dreams literally die in front of you? I can't imagine what it would have been like. But in the midst of that, they let their hope die too, his disciples. But not this thief. And what's the difference? What's the difference? The difference is faith. The difference is choosing to believe that Jesus is who he says he is, that he's going to do what he says that he'll do, and that he's come and that he'll come again. We have a choice, right? We have a choice to be like the thief that trusted or the disciples who doubted. And it falls to us to decide that what we're going to be. After my grandpa picked my grandma up that day and they got on the bus, they drove around for a little while, and he reached in his pocket. Some of you know what's coming. And he had a little box. And in the box was a ring, not a small ring. It was a diamond, a single solitaire round cut diamond on a gold band. And he took that ring out of the box, and he looked at her in her eyes, and he told her all the things that he liked about her. And he asked her if she would be his wife, right? If she would spend the rest of her life loving him. So this is a great story. And she said yes, and he put the ring on her finger. And as she hugged him, it all started to make sense. He didn't pick me up in the car. He has a diamond ring. He had sold his car because she was more important to him than the car was, because the dream of spending a life with her meant more than public transportation, right? He knew that her becoming his wife was the thing that he wanted more than anything else, and that he was willing to give up the car that he had gone to war to earn, to have her be his bride. I love that story. I ask my grandma to tell me that story all the time, and while she tells it, I hold her hand and I touch her ring and I laugh and I cry with her, and we remember him because he passed away. But he was a good man, and I love that story because it reminds me of where I come from. That in my family there's a legacy of love, and that's how it started. It reminds me that we believe that people are more important than things, and that if love is to mean something, it should cost something. And that is the story of Good Friday. That love costs something. When we look at this picture as a whole, we see that God so loved the world that he sent Jesus to be this new Passover lamb, to create a new covenant, to fulfill the obligation that our sin demands. That Jesus came that we might know life. And that wherever we find ourselves in this story, if we're zealous Peter and we're all over the map, or if we're Pilate and we're unwilling to face the truth, or if we see ourselves more as a doubting disciple who's given up at the last moment, or if we're Simon and we've been drafted and we don't even feel like we chose it, it doesn't matter, because those aren't the central characters of this story. The central character of this story is Jesus, who stands and says that he is the Prince of Peace and the mighty God. We read, and when we see what Jesus did for us, as his last word, he said, "It is finished." And what did he mean by "it is finished"? Not his life. He meant that sin, that death, that all of the things that he had come to talk about and to proclaim and to share, that everything that his mission had meant to accomplish had been accomplished. And in that moment, death was done. When we look at Jesus, we see a broken body, but that broken body means our wholeness. When we look at Jesus in this story, we see his shed blood, but that shed blood means that we can be clean. When we look at Jesus, we realize that all of the pieces of our life that don't make sense suddenly come to find their meaning in the hope that is Jesus. And it's all because we remembered this story about what he did. It's the story that he asks us to remember when we come together. It's the central point of what it means to follow him, that we believe that this is true, that we believe that not just that it's true, but that it has the power to change us, that it has the power to change our very being, that in fact the way that we are born isn't the way that we have to die, because Jesus can make us new. And that's powerful, and it's exciting, and it's the kind of story that we should be able to listen to again and again and again and be excited about the Jesus who loved us so much that he would die for us. And so tonight, as the worship team comes, we're going to sing a little bit about Jesus, and I want to pray for you guys and have a little bit of time for response, but we're going to sing one song before we do that, and it's a hymn. It's one of my favorite hymns. And as we sing it, I want you to just think about the words that Jesus loved us so much. It's an incredible love, and it cost him everything that he had. And our only response to that can be gratitude and surrender.